Ja, vielen Dank, Bilgin. Herzlich willkommen auch von meiner Seite. Guten Abend. Ich freue mich, euch unseren Referenten ganz kurz vorzustellen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir für die Eröffnung unserer Ringvorlesung einen so ausgewiesenen Experten gewinnen konnten. Kamel Doraï, er beschäftigt sich seit vielen, vielen Jahren mit Migrationsbewegungen und der Situation von Geflüchteten im Nahen Osten. Kamel Doraï hat in Frankreich studiert und sich schon in seinem Studium eigentlich auf internationale Migration spezialisiert. 2001 hat er seine Dissertation abgeschlossen mit einem Buch zur Geografie des Exils, in der er sich mit den palästinensischen Flüchtlingen im Libanon auseinandergesetzt hat. Seit seiner Dissertation, seit 2002, ist er Forscher am CNRS, am Centre National de Recherche Scientifique in Frankreich stationiert und hat dann verschiedene Forschungsprojekte koordiniert, die angesiedelt waren in Frankreich, unter anderem bei MIGRINTER, aber auch in Syrien, in Damaskus und im Libanon, in Beirut. Momentan forscht Kamel Doraï für das CNRS am Institut Français du Proche-Orient in Amman in Jordanien. Vor kurzem hat er ein neues Forschungsprojekt, ein transnationales Forschungsprojekt gestartet, das er auch koordiniert, das ganz viele Forschende umfasst, und das hat den Titel Time of Conflict, Time of Migration. Das ist ein 3-jähriges Projekt, bei dem Forschende von verschiedenen Disziplinen involviert sind und das zum Ziel hat, vertiefte Kenntnisse zu gewinnen über aktuelle Fluchtbewegungen im Nahen Osten infolge der aktuellen Umbrüche in dieser Region. Der Schwerpunkt liegt dabei auf der Situation von Geflüchteten in Jordanien, im Libanon und in der Türkei, wobei diese Bewegung von Geflüchteten in einen regionalen und auch in einen historischen Kontext gestellt werden. Wir können sehr gespannt sein auf dieses Forschungsprojekt, das eben jetzt gerade kürzlich gestartet ist. Kamel Doraï hat ganz bedeutende und innovative Forschung gemacht zu Urban Refugees und zu den Urbanisierungsprozessen von Flüchtlingscamps sowie auch zu den transnationalen und den sozioräumlichen Praktiken von Flüchtlingen in wie auch außerhalb von Flüchtlingscamps. Und davon wird er uns auch heute etwas erzählen. Sein Ansatz ist ein transdisziplinärer, kann man wohl sagen. Ich habe ihn gar nicht gefragt, was er ist. Er ist, glaube ich, Geograf. Also der PhD war in Geografie, aber ich glaube, er ist genauso auch Anthropologe, politischer Soziologe, vielleicht auch Politologe. Also fließende disziplinäre Grenzen, ist da auch grenzüberschreitend unterwegs, würde ich sagen. Kamel Doraï studiert die Dynamiken der Migration auch ausgehend von verschiedenen methodischen Zugängen. Er stützt sich nicht nur auf Policy-Analysen, sondern forscht vor allem auch ethnografisch. Er hat selber lange Zeit in Flüchtlingscamps gewohnt, gelebt und ist damit auch ein Forscher, der eben nicht einfach nur vom Schreibtisch aus waltet. Kamel Doraï wird heute Einblicke geben in seine Forschung, auch in seine aktuelle Forschung, und damit, so denke ich, eine wunderbare Einleitung geben in diese Reihe, in diese Ringvorlesung. Der Titel seines Vortrags, A New Geography of Exile, State, Conflict and Forced Migration in the Middle East. Ich freue mich sehr, Kamel Doraï, herzlich willkommen. Und ich möchte noch etwas sagen zur Übersetzung. Ich weiß nicht, ob das alle mitbekommen haben. Wer es noch nicht weiß, die Übersetzung von Englisch auf Deutsch wird mit Kopfhörer organisiert. Man kann sich hinten noch einen Kopfhörer holen, jetzt, gerade in dem Moment, wenn man noch sich bedienen will. Auf Kanal 1 auf Deutsch, auf Kanal 3 auf Englisch. Und noch etwas zum Ablauf des Abends, damit ihr etwas wisst, was euch erwartet. Kamel Doraï wird jetzt rund 45 Minuten sprechen, einen Vortrag machen, unterstützt mit PowerPoint-Folien. Danach wird es eine Diskussion geben, die moderiert wird von Maurus Reinkowski, und die ersten Fragen werden dann von ihm kommen und nachher wird das Podium eröffnet und ihr könnt auch aus dem Publikum Fragen stellen. So um 7:45, allerspätestens um 8 Uhr wird die Veranstaltung beenden. Ich wünsche euch viel Vergnügen.
of all, I would like really to thank the organizers to giving me the opportunity to talk to you tonight and to introduce such an interesting program that you have presented. And I would have been pleased to be able to attend all the different conferences because it seems to be a very interesting topic, and not many universities in European countries are developing such a huge and large program on such an important and up-to-date crisis. Well, I will try to focus today on the refugee issues in the Middle East, and of course most of my presentation will deal and will talk about the Syrian refugee crisis, but not only. Well, after an introduction, I will just develop and divide my presentation into 4 main points. First of all, an overall perspective on refugees in the Middle East, and with a few historical and geographical context, in order to give you the importance of the current Syrian refugee crisis in its context. Then I will focus on the current Syrian refugee crisis, giving some examples, especially in Lebanon and in Jordan, where I'm conducting in these 2 countries fieldworks since 2013. And I'm based in Jordan since 2014. And then I will turn on my 3rd point, that is not something that is not very known, but I will focus on the Palestinians from Syria. Some of them, and a large part of them, have been pushed out of Syria, and they were already refugees in this country. So I will just elaborate a little bit on this specific situation. It is very important and not very famous situation. And finally, I will conclude trying to put this into perspective with the European Union refugee crisis, or the European refugee crisis, or the so-called European refugee crisis. And so I think that what I will give you first, the elements that will be developed on the Middle East are quite interesting when we compare it to the European situation. Well, as I told, my presentation will focus mainly on 3 countries, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. I had the opportunity to make research in these 3 countries and to live in these different countries. And what has to keep in mind, and this is a very important point, and I would like to start with this, that when I settled in Syria in 2006, Syria was the first asylum country in the Middle East for Iraqi refugees. Nearly 500,000 of Iraqis have found asylum in this country, and nearly 500,000 of Palestinians were already living in these countries as refugees since 1948. So when we talk about Syrian refugees, it's quite strange because only 10 years ago, it was the main asylum country in the region. So things changes very rapidly. And I think that it's one of the main aspects of the refugee crisis in the Middle East. It's that we have cross movements from different groups from one side to another country. And secondly, I would just point also a very interesting situation that I will just mention today because I'm not working on Iraq. But currently, thousands of refugees from Syria have found asylum in northern Iraq, while at the same time, people from Iraq, and especially I began a small study on Christian refugees coming from northern Iraq in Jordan, and thousands of refugees are leaving the same areas, and especially the so-called Islamic State area, where they took control of some part of northern Iraq, and then they had to flee. So at the same time, we have cross movements of refugees. And this is a specificity of the Middle East. The same country can be at the same time a country where people leave because of war or economic difficulties or political problems, and at the same time, other groups can find asylum in safe areas at the same place. So it's very interesting to see that there is this cross movement all over the region. And what I'm going to do now is to give you some historical perspective, and when we look at the historical perspective, we can see that since the creation of the different states and the independence of the different states after World War II in the region, this has been always the case. There have been always refugee movements in the region, and the refugee movement were just coming from different countries at the same time. Well, as you may all know, forced migration is not a new phenomenon in the Middle East. It's related to the rather recent state-building process in the region. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the Middle Eastern countries, the Middle Eastern geography has been completely transformed with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the division of this region in several small states. And of course, one of the main problems in the Middle East with the creation of these different states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, is that the boundaries do not match the different ethnic, religious, national groups. So some of the groups are scattered between the different boundaries. And this is not a new phenomenon. We can see that since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is still existing, is not solved, and Palestine is still not existing as a state as such. And another example would be the Kurdish example. That is, of course, one of the most important and symptomatic phenomenon in the region. Kurds are divided between different countries. You have one autonomous government in the northern of Iraq, but in the other countries they have no form of independence, or any forms of state is created in the other part of the Middle East. So Palestinians and Kurds are the two ignored nations in the Middle East, and they still don't have any state to represent them. So this is one of the main problem is the recent character of all this boundary definition, and still most of the countries, the boundary in some part between Lebanon and Syria is not clear, between Syria and Iraq is not clear, and in many regions you have unclear boundaries. So the national boundaries are not very clear in the region, and they are crossed by a lot of migration movements. They can be commercial circulation, they can be refugee movements, they can be also guest workers, but they can be also family movements, and this is very important. Many families have been divided and settled in different states, and many tribes also have been divided between different states. So you still have movements of people marrying between one state and another because they belong to the same family, they belong to the same tribe, and it's today, for example, the case. The northern part of Jordan and the southern part of Syria have deep tribal links since decades. So, I mean, the arrival of Syrians in this part of northern Jordan is not a new phenomenon at all, and it was not forced migration, but it was classical and different kind of circular migration between these different countries and regions. These boundaries are very paradoxical in the Middle East. On the one hand, it's very strict control, very strict border control, and it's very hard for migrants to cross these boundaries. There is nothing looks like Schengen area like in Europe, but borders are very strict. It can be very complicated, for example, for a Palestinian to cross each of this boundary. When a Palestinian is in Lebanon, he cannot come, for example, for Jordan. In Jordan, it's not possible. It's very, very hard to obtain a visa. And at the same time, you have this old movements, old circulation of commercial circulation, tribal circulation between the countries. Most of them are illegal or informal circulation between these boundaries. So this is a paradoxical phenomenon. Very strict and very controlled boundaries on one hand, but still a lot of circulation. And one of the most relevant paradox is that it's the region where it's the highest percentage of refugees in the world are, compared to the total population, is in the Middle East. For example, in Lebanon, a quarter of the population are refugees today, and in Jordan, nearly half of the total population are from refugee origin or are refugees today, if we add Palestinians, Iraqis, and today Syrians. So it's a huge number of refugees. But to understand how people move, why did they choose at a certain period of time to go to a country or to another? When Syrians, for example, leave Syria, they have the possibility to go basically to 4 countries. They have the possibility to go, theoretically at least, to Lebanon, they have the possibility to go to Jordan, they have the possibility to go to Turkey or to northern Iraq. And it's not random. I mean, people choose more or less where they go. And it's important to know that we had huge and old diasporas in the region, and that partially explains why people settle in an area or another. And when I will go to, and I will talk about Lebanon and about Jordan, I will give you examples to show you how people just left and why did they choose, even if their migration is forced, to go to a country and or to another. And probably, and that's one of the points that I studied when I worked on Sweden, it's the same thing in Europe. People just don't want to go anywhere in Europe, but they still have some kind of link, some kind of diasporic link before. And so they should be able at least to express some form of choice in terms of the country of final destination. So one of the most important things in the region is that it's conflict that is the main reason that people leave their country of origin. As I told you, it's one of the highest refugee population in the world, but they are, and I will just go now to this point, they live in a very precarious legal context, and this is also a paradox. This region is the region where most of the refugees in the world live, and this region is one of the only only region where countries are not signatory of the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugee Rights. So this is a paradox. So they don't have any asylum system, and UNHCR works in the different states with what they call a Memorandum of Understanding, a MOU, that is a short text or a short letter that express the role of the state and how does the state wants UNHCR work in its country. I think that as an example, what Lebanon and what UNHCR decided to sign in 2003, when after the fall of Saddam Hussein regime and some of the Iraqis left Iraq and came to Lebanon. Lebanon signed an MOU with UNHCR, and the terms are very clear, and it gives you an idea of the situation of the refugees in the Middle East. So it states basically that Lebanon does not consider itself as an asylum country. This is the first point. Second, the only viable and durable solution for refugees recognized under the mandate of UNHCR is resettlement in a third country. It means that no refugees will be allowed to stay on the long term in the country. When you think that Palestinians are living since 1948, it's quite interesting. And the MOU seeks to provide temporary humanitarian solution for the problems of people entering clandestinely, residing unlawfully in Lebanon, and submitting asylum application at UNHCR. It means that there is no other purpose of seeking asylum in Lebanon other than being resettled in a third country or go back to its country of origin. So there is nothing linked to refugee rights, nothing linked to a refugee status, nothing linked to possibilities of acquiring, for example, citizenship or to acquire permanent residency rights. And this is the case in Lebanon, but it was the case in Syria, and it's the case currently in Jordan. And except the very specific situation of the Palestinians that I will develop later. To give you an overall idea of the number of refugees, we built this map. I mean, numbers are always problematic in the Middle East, so don't take these numbers as something that is real, but it's just an idea. The overall population of Jordan now, it's between 7 and 9 millions. Nobody knows exactly. The Jordanian government pretends that there is more than 1.3 million of Syrian refugees in the country, where there are only 600 or 1,000 are registered by the UNHCR. So you have huge discrepancies between the different numbers. We can go back on this in the question later if you want, but I will not elaborate on this because it's a very complex problem. But you have to keep in mind that we have very small countries with very limited population and huge numbers of refugees since 1940, since 1920s, if we took the Armenians, that I will talk a little bit, and Palestinians, and then Iraqis, and today Syrians. So no legal status, no protection, no asylum law, no asylum system, no refugee status, except for the very specific case of the Palestinians in a region where most of the refugees in the world live today. So, as I told you, it's not a new phenomenon. The first big wave of refugees have been created after the Armenian genocide at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Armenians have found asylum in different parts of the Middle East, especially Syria and Lebanon, which was the two main countries where they found asylum. And so the first refugee camps were built by the French at this time because they had the mandate on Lebanon. And the first photo they can see, Borj Hammoud in the 30s, it's a refugee camp that still exists. I mean, still you can see and you can visit this camp that is now part of the city, of course. It's a part of a larger Borj Hammoud municipality. But the camp is still named camp in the city. And then this was the first big wave of refugees. Some of them settled in Lebanon and Syria, and some others pushed their way and went to European countries, and a lot of them went to France at this time. So, since this period of time, Middle Eastern countries were countries where refugees settle, integrate, became citizens, as it was the case for Armenians, or were just transiting through this part of the world to go to other countries. So, I mean, even the current Syrian refugee crisis, where people settle in the Middle East and then leave to Europe, it's something that is very, very old. It's absolutely not a new phenomenon. Then you have the second photo, Shatila camp. It's a Palestinian refugee camp that was tense in 1948, and now it's a part of the city. And as you can see, it's a very dense area where Palestinians are still living since 1948. And a lot of other refugee groups settled in this area, in all the different Palestinian refugee camps since 1948. The third photo is an Iraqi neighborhood in Damascus. This was the third big wave of refugees after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Of course, after the first American invasion in 1990, a lot of refugees fled Iraq, and it is probably assumed that like 2 million of Iraqis left their country since the 90s in different waves, in 90s and then in 2003 after the fall of Saddam Hussein regime. And still, some of the refugees were present in Syria in 2011 when the war broke. And some of them went back to Iraq, and some of them tried to escape and find asylum in third countries like European countries or Northern America or Australia. And the last photo is the biggest, now one of the biggest refugee camp in the world and one of the biggest refugee camp in the Middle East. That is Za'atari refugee camp. It has been a camp with a lot of tents at the beginning, but since 2015, most of the tents have disappeared, and now it's a kind of no man's land where a lot of Syrian refugees live. and I will just show you some more details after. So most of these refugee camps became part of the city. And one has to know that the urbanization of the Middle East is mainly due to refugee and forced migration movements, be it internal movements from South Lebanon to Beirut, like all the southern part of Beirut. And it's also the case of international migrants and refugees. So when we talk about this refugee population, the first photo is quite interesting. It's when I was doing my PhD in South Lebanon. And Rashidiyya camp is one of the biggest Palestinian camps in South Lebanon. And it used to be an Armenian refugee camp. And the small house that you see in the middle of all this Zinco building is the old Armenian refugee camp houses that were built of stone by French. But most of the Armenians didn't want to live in southern Lebanon, so they went to Beirut, in Borj Hamoud mostly. And so they left the camp, and in 1948, when the Palestinian arrived in the country, they settled in Armenian refugee camp. And it's something that is quite usual. It's not, I mean, other places were like this, and now you have Syrians who settle in the Palestinian camps, who used to be Armenian camps before. So it's very interesting to see that if you look at them on a historical perspective, the same places are reused by new waves of refugees. And the photos on the bottom is just to show you an example of the evolution of a Palestinian refugee camp, a very big one, that had been settled in 1967, close to, on the northern part of Amman. And it's a Palestinian camp. And now in Jordan, with the Syrian refugees, we already are in the second step, from the tent to temporary shelters. And then probably it will move to this kind of slum or squat rapidly. You know, it's a very rapid process, and it always exists in this part of the world. So the idea of a refugee camp is completely transformed and challenged in the Middle Eastern experience. It's not places like tents, it's not temporary places, but as you may have seen, from the Armenian experience to the current Syrian experience, we have nearly 100 years of asylum in the same places. And so these places are reused, are urbanized, and are reused by different ways of refugees. So it's also another paradox that we can notice in the Middle East. Something that should be, or normally is temporary, becomes like permanent. Even it's always thought as being temporary. And what is interesting is that you have also another paradox, that the people who live in these neighborhoods of cities are still under very precarious legal status. They don't have citizenship, they don't have access to basic rights, they don't have access to work for some of them. So it's a very paradoxical situation in the Middle East. And so the one that I worked extensively on it is Palestinian refugee camps, and I drew these two maps just to show you. This first map is when more or less when the Palestinians settled after the different wars, after the creation of Israel in 1948, and it's the map of today, the refugee camps, where they are. So we still have 58 Palestinian camps in the Middle East. Some of them were created in 1948, and some of them were created in 1967, after the total occupation of the Palestinian historical, the Palestinian in the borders of the British Mandate. So I think it's quite obvious that most of these places became part of the cities, and that what we see today from the Iraqi crisis or from the Syrian crisis as being something temporary is probably going to last for decades. And so one has to have in mind that all of these different refugee movements are not temporary. And so long-term solution has to be, one has to think about this long-term perspective. And so moving now to the point of the current Syrian crisis, I found this map quite interesting, that we can see that since the fall of the USSR, the Syrian crisis, in terms of numbers at least, is the most problematic and the largest refugee crisis in the world, not only in the Middle East, not only in the Mediterranean region, but it's the most problematic and largest refugee movement in the world. So it's a very central problem today, and I think that with South Sudan, that is not under the projector of medias, is also a very, very deep crisis, an old crisis, but still Syria is the largest movement since the fall of the USSR. So with more than 4 million refugees. But the current Syrian crisis, and this is my second point, is more than 4 million refugees. It's also 7 million of internally displaced Syrians inside their own country. So it's 11 million of people that had to leave their house, 4 million abroad, 7 million inside the country. It means that it's nearly 50% of the total Syrian population before the war. So it's a huge, huge, huge refugee movement. So this refugee movement is also linked and partially it explains the current geography of exile of the Syrian population. They were like 400,000 Syrian workers in Lebanon before the war. And you may already all know that Syria has occupied a large part of Lebanon since during decades after 1990s and the end of the civil war until 2005. And nearly 50,000 Syrian workers were present in Jordan also before the war. So there are a lot of migration links, and so history plays a very important role. So for these two countries, they adopted two different settlement policies. And this is extremely linked to their own history and their own perception that they had of refugee movements. Since Palestinians were settled in camps, most of the Arab countries refused to build new camps because they thought, and that more or less what they were saying, we don't want another Palestinian problem. If we open refugee camps, then the people will settle and stay in the countries and become poverty pockets, urban problems, political problems, and even if we think of the recent history of Jordan and of Lebanon, one has to remember a Black September in 1970 in Jordan, where there was a revolt of Palestinians, and the civil war in Lebanon, where Palestinians have played a role. I mean, we can also discuss about this role, but I mean, they were part of the civil war. And the camps were places where a lot of weapons circulate, a lot of security problems were created, even if it's not linked to the Palestinian refugees as such, but I mean, political organization, Palestinian political organization were present. And so they were part of this war in Lebanon, and they were part of troubles also in Jordan. So basically, no camps for the Iraqis, no camps for the Sudanese, no camp for the Somalis who have settled in the Middle East. And at the beginning, none of the countries wanted to have camps for the Syrians. For the Iraqis, it was quite easy, because most of the Iraqis, post-2003, they were origin from urban middle class. So they went to the main cities, and they can integrate quite easily. But the Syrian crisis is a completely different crisis. Most of the refugees come from rural area, from very poverty. They face a lot of problems like poverty, not educated, and so it's a completely different social profile. So they face much more difficulties for a large part of them to settle and integrate in the cities. Lebanon has decided not to open any camp until now. There is no official refugee camp for Syrians in Lebanon. So basically, with the development of the refugee crisis, what happens, there have been huge, like more than 1,000 places where they settled. It can be in the main cities, it can be in Palestinian refugee camps, but it can be also in informal settlements in rural areas. And so basically, you found Syrians everywhere, small settlements everywhere, and it's completely different forms, from tents in the Biqa Valley, so in the place on the boundary with Syria, and in small, deprived areas. So you have now neighborhoods in Beirut where you nearly have, at a local level, like 50% of Syrian inhabitants. It's the case in Nab'a, that is between Burj Hammoud and Beirut. It's a small, very poor area where most of the Lebanese left and where the Syrian settled. And the point for Lebanon is we don't want anymore to reproduce the Palestinian situation, and so we want to keep the Syrians in different areas. We don't want them to gather like in a large part, because there is a lot of political and security problems that can be developed with if they were to create like very big gatherings. And when you think that there is more than 1 million now Syrian registered at the UNHCR in Lebanon, you can easily imagine how large can be refugee camps if they were to be created in Lebanon. But the Palestinian experience, I mean, until the Iraqi crisis of 2003, when you were talking about a refugee in the Middle East, it couldn't be something else, someone else than a Palestinian. It was like synonymous. I mean, Palestinian is a refugee and refugee is a Palestinian. They couldn't think. Even the Iraqis, when I was doing my study in Syria, they hardly can define themselves as refugees, because they were thinking that, well, we are not Palestinians. I mean, we are Iraqis. We have a state. We have a citizenship. So we are not refugees. We are just leaving the country because of troubles, but they didn't thought that they were refugees. And even Syrians today, it's very complicated for them to be considered as a refugee, because the term in itself in the region means Palestinian. In Jordan, it's a completely different situation. Jordan has refused to open refugee camps until mid-2012. So during 1 year and a half, there was no refugee camps. And then they decided, for different reasons, we can go back this in the question because it's a very complicated problem for Jordan, but they decided to open 3 refugee camps to settle the Syrians. One of the first reasons is because there was a boom of arrivals at the same time, so they really had to manage how can we accommodate such a large numbers of Syrians in such a very limited period of time. We have to have in mind that some days, like 3,000 Syrian refugees were entering every day the country at the same time. So Jordan has 2 different kinds of refugee camps. They had 3 main refugee camps where Syrians settle, and they have other refugee camps that are transit camps through each. Syrian transit, they have security check if they can enter the country, and if they are allowed, then they are sent to one of the 3 refugee camps. And they can go out of the refugee camp. So basically, all the Syrians after mid-2012 went through one of the different refugee camps in the country. And some of them managed to get outside because only 20% now are living in a refugee camp, but the 80% are living abroad. So a part of them arrived before mid-2012, so they can settle where they wanted. And the other part, they have to have a sponsor, a Jordanian sponsor, to get out of the refugee camp. So basically, you can live outside of the camp if you have a Jordanian who says, okay, I agree to give my name to the security, then I am your kafil in Arabic, so I am your sponsor. So you are allowed to live outside the camp. So basically they have 2 different IDs, one ID for the Syrians inside the camps and one ID for the Syrians outside the camps. And the Syrians that lives inside the camp have to ask for a permit to get out of the camp. They are not allowed to go back and forth as they want. The biggest refugee camp where I'm conducting studies is Zaatari refugee camp. It's a Mafraq governorate. It's in the northern part of Jordan. It's 20 kilometers from the Syrian border. And it used to be a very small refugee camp. And then it transformed into a very huge city. It has had more than 150,000 inhabitants at a period of time. Then some other part left back to Syria, or in other part of Jordan, they managed to get out, and now it's like 85,000 inhabitants in this huge city. So it looks like this. There is, at the entrance, Syrians developed a huge market that is called Champs-Élysées, because Syrians try to develop a sense of, try to develop active and they are quite funny, even if they face very huge difficulties. So they created a huge marketplace that is a long street where you can find basically everything: restaurants, groceries, hairdressers, jewelries, whatever you want, you can find in this place. Of course, it has been a huge discussion with UNHCR and local authorities in order to develop this. But you have to keep in mind it's only 4 years ago there was nothing. It was a desert at this place. It was only rocks. So, I mean, it's something that is quite rapid as a form of urban development. And then you have different kinds of settlements. That's the picture I took in different parts of the refugee camp, knowing that the tents that you can see above is nearly now not existing as such. They have been all transformed into this kind of shelters. They are not allowed to build in concrete. So they have to adapt all this. So basically, the UNHCR gives this. And then what they do is that they cut it, they transform it, and then they rebuild houses like the houses that they had in southern Syria. It's completely forbidden, of course, but they do this and they sell caravans. They call it caravan. So they sell it, they buy it, they transform it, and it's a completely different life that is existing. And outside the camp, we have exactly the same system. It was previously tents, and now it has become like small houses. Outside the camp, it's in concrete, but you have exactly the same kind of development. They cannot stay even if they know that it's a temporary shelter, they wanted to adapt it to recreate life in exile, and this is extremely important. So the second refugee camp that has been developed, I don't have photos because I never been, it's Azraq refugee camps, where UNHCR decided that was not normal that the refugees can do whatever they want with their own housing. So they decided to put the caravan in the land and that they cannot transform it. It's absolutely not possible to transform, to move it, or to transform it. So Azraq camp, that is supposed to be like a model camp, is a camp where there is no life. It's forbidden to transform, to move, to have any economic activity. So, and what is interesting is that UNHCR, not all of them, of course, but some of the people in UNHCR thought that it's a counter of, they learned lessons from Zaatari. They said that Zaatari is a very bad example because it's becoming a city. So we have to do something that is more, controlled. And so nobody wants to go in Azraq, so everybody tries to leave. And the people in Zaatari, they managed to recreate a kind of normal life. Of course, normal, with very limited possibilities. So basically, it's what a refugee camp today, it's what it looks like in Jordan today. So refugee camp is to control population, is to bring humanitarian assistance, is a way to say to the people, if you don't respect the law in the country, then you will be sent into a refugee camp. So it's a way of controlling population, of course. And it's becoming now what we can call a makeshift city. And this is, I think, very, very interesting as a new form of how refugees can contribute to develop new form of urban development in the region. And it's interesting because we are witnessing similar developments in European countries, where France has recently opened refugee camps at the border with Britain, with the UK, but also in other parts of France to settle the Syrian refugees who were arriving. So the policy, and I will rapidly give a few elements. So basically the policy of these two countries, Jordan and Lebanon, has been quite clear. Until 2013, open door policy for Syrians. It was allowed, all the Syrians were allowed and admitted into these countries, except a few cases for security reasons, of course. And in 2013, they turned to limit the entry of refugees. The first one, that I will talk about in a few seconds, are the Palestinians, who experimented the first. They began with them. They began to limit movements and restrictions on movement on Palestinians, and then in turn to all the Syrian population. That in 2014, it's quite more or less the borders with Lebanon and Jordan are quite closed for these two countries. So since 2014, it's extremely hard for any Syrian to cross the boundary. And now you have thousands of refugees in a no man's land between Syria and Jordan, because they are not allowed to enter. So Jordan has decided to accept some of them, so it's, the problem is probably will be solved in a few weeks, but still it's very, very limited possibilities. So the focus rapidly, because I'm running out of time, on the Palestinians from Syria. Well, nearly 500,000 of Palestinians were living in Syria since 1948. It was one of the most integrated Palestinian refugee community with Jordan. In Jordan, they had citizenship. In Syria, they had access to everything, but not the citizenship. They were still stateless refugees. But they can be civil servants, they can have access to a free education, free healthcare, and so on and so forth. I mean, most of the Palestinians try not to participate into the uprising, but they were caught into the conflict, and most of them had to leave. So half of it considered by the UNRWA, the UN agency who deals with Palestinians, that half of the Palestinians are internally displaced, and like 70,000 of them had to leave the country, and most of them are now in Lebanon, because Jordan has closed its boundary to Palestinians very rapidly for various reasons that we can discuss later on. So most of them are in Lebanon. It's not a new phenomenon at all. Every war that happens in the region, Palestinians are forced to move and are not allowed to enter neighboring countries. It was the case in 1990s in Kuwait, in 1945 expelled from Libya. They were not allowed to enter out of all countries. In 2003, they were expelled from Iraq, and they were in no man's land refugee camp between Syria and Iraq. No countries. I mean, Syria had a completely open door policy for everyone who is coming from Iraq, except Palestinians. And now in Syria, like 70,000 of them had to leave. One of the very interesting things is that Palestinians, when they leave their country where they reside, they are no more recognized as refugees. They have their residency, their refugee status is only recognized in the country of settlement. So if they are registered in Syria, when they leave to Lebanon, they are considered as illegal migrants. No more refugees. So that's what I call refugees seeking asylum. It's completely paradoxical, but in the Middle East, it's completely normal to lose its refugee status when we cross a boundary. Where do they live? They live, for half of them, in the Palestinian camps that were already existing in Lebanon, nearly half of them. And in the northern part of Lebanon, it's even more. So it looks like this. This is a Palestinian informal settlement in South Lebanon. And, well, I will talk about this tomorrow in the lecture, in the seminar, but it's just, this is a Palestinian settlement where nearly probably 20 to 30% of the inhabitants live in Denmark and in Germany, and in Sweden also. So the diaspora built new. It's completely informal. It's absolutely not allowed to build anything in this part. But they built new apartments. And so the Syrians, the Palestinians from Syria, when they came, they rented or settled in their house of family or friends. So it's like slums. And Syrians, Palestinians from Syria, try to settle in this very, very poor and deprived area. They have absolutely no access to the international asylum regime. They are not taken into consideration by UNHCR because they are Palestinians, and Palestinians are excluded from the UNHCR mandate because they have UNRWA. But UNRWA can hardly help them and assist them because they are running out of money, and they already have 58 refugee camps to manage. So it's a new population that they have to manage. So they are deprived of any rights. So many of them are illegal migrants in Lebanon. So they settle in these refugee camps and they cannot go out because they don't have residency permit. And the refugee camps in Lebanon, most of them are controlled by the Lebanese army. So you have a checkpoint. So if you get out of the camp, you get caught by the police and by the army, and you can be sent back to Syria. So they live in a very, very, very precarious situation. And it's not new. I mean, it's a very old phenomenon, but I wanted to just shed light on this very specific situation because it really tells a lot about refugee status in the Middle East and how precarious can it be, even if you are recognized as a refugee. So to conclude, because I'm talking since I finished my time, so I will just very briefly go to the European refugee crisis, and probably we can discuss it later in the discussion and in the questions. Well, if you add, and this is the number of EU plus Switzerland and Norway, so it's not all the European countries. I mean, it's just EU, so it's 28 plus 2. It's less than only Jordan. European countries is more than 500 million inhabitants. So it's very, very, very small. I mean, if you compare that, Lebanon is 4 million inhabitants, Jordan is between 7 and 9 million. So if you compare in terms of numbers, one can hardly find it as a European crisis. And especially if you look at the map, it's 3 to 4 countries that gathered most of the refugees. So it's not a crisis for example, my country, France. We cannot consider that it's a crisis when you have just like between 5,000 to 7,000 Syrians, asylum seekers or refugees recognized in France. It's really a very, very, very small number. And so to conclude, the problem is, probably we can ask different questions that probably help us to understand the situation now in Europe. Some of the people said, why now all the refugees are coming? This is one of the main questions that is asked often. Well, why now? Because the conflict is now 5 years old. So there are more and more refugees in the Middle East also. It's not only in Europe, but all the Middle Eastern countries are facing the same situation. There's just a difference in time. The conflict is changing in nature. Since the ISIS and the Islamic State took a large part of Syria, there is no more safe place in Syria. Whether you are bombed by the coalition, by the regime, by ISIS, I mean, there is no safe place. So people just left because there was no other possibilities. Also because in the Middle East, as I told you, there was changing border policies. Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan closed more or less the boundary to new asylum system. Also, what is very interesting, and when you talk of this with European officials, there is a completely lack of interest. There was no resettlement policies implemented since the beginning of the crisis. So, of course, at a certain period of time, the people don't wait to be resettled, they resettle themselves, because there is no other choice. And there is no other choice because they face economic problems in the host country, they face legal problems in their country of origin. And one has to imagine that to live in Jordan is extremely expensive for Syrian refugees. I mean, it costs like 200 euros per month to rent something. It seems to be quite low, but when you have absolutely no right to work, it's huge. And when you compare it to what costs to emigrate to a country where you can have rights, so of course people decide that it's better to leave, because after 5 years of spending all their savings they have to find a solution. So also you have this very important thing that they run out of money and they run out of any perspective in their country of settlement. And just, this is not very clear, but I wanted just to show you this last part. It just shows you that most of the refugees are Syrians, but not only. So the Syrian crisis is not the only crisis, and Afghans, Iraqis are also entering Europe at the same time. So we have to keep in mind that we just focus on Syria, and but it's not the, unfortunately, it's not the only refugee crisis that affects Europe. And I would like to thank you for your attention.